Okay, so we are going to begin our unit on India, and we begin with the cities of the Indus Valley, and that's where the Indian civilization first begins, is in the valleys, the river valley that surrounds the Indus River. It's one of the major river systems. So first we're going to look at the geography of India because that has a lot to do with how India actually develops as a civilization. So looking at the geography, we have the subcontinent of India itself. And a subcontinent just means that it's a large landmass that juts out from a continent. And so the subcontinent of India juts out from the continent of Asia. It includes three countries, that is India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Along its northern border is a mountain region, which is a good barrier, which allows for the Indian civilization to be somewhat protected, kind of the same way that the Roman civilization was protected on Italy, that they had a mountain system to the north. Well, so do the Indians, and so that's going to prevent them from being attacked multiple times and allows their civilization to grow and develop. So within the subcontinent of India itself, there is also three different separate regions of this subcontinent. The first is that you have the northern plains, and this has a lot of river valleys or a lot of river systems, and so it's very well watered, so a lot of farming is going to take place there. A lot of trade is going to take place there. And so the rivers that go through there include the Indus River, the Ganges River, the Brahmaputra. There are many rivers other than that, but those are the main ones. Then in the middle you have the Deccan Plateau, and Deccan is Deccan, and it's very dry upon this plateau. It's very arid, which means not a whole lot of farming. It's kind of unproductive. And as a result, the Deccan Plateau is not very well populated. There's not going to be a lot of population that lives there because it's not very productive. And then along the edges of the subcontinent, you have the coastal plains. And that's where you're going to see, again, some trading ports and some harbors and those kinds of things. And so it's a major trade route. And then fishing is going to be popular there as well. Well, India is also subject to monsoons, and monsoons are seasonal winds that come through, and they bring the rains that are desperately needed for the crops. And so they are always planning around the monsoon season. That's when they are expecting that major rainfall to help them with their agriculture. So now that we've seen the geography, let's look at the first Indian civilization. Well, the first Indian civilization was around 2500 BCE. There's writings, but we haven't deciphered them, so we really don't know a whole lot about them. Our knowledge of this time period in Indian history is very sparse. But we do know that they had two major cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. And there's some speculation on whether or not these were kind of like twin capital cities, located a distance apart from each other so that they could control their own areas. Now, these cities are rather unique because they are very large for the time period. They're about 3 miles in circumference, which is really big for cities of this time period. But they're also well planned. The roads are set up on a grid pattern, which is also very unique and unusual. They also had platforms for sacrifices. They had citadels for protection, kind of like a last refuge in case you get attacked sort of thing. The houses that were in these two cities were all built with the same pattern. So it shows kind of the technology that they had at the time, because they were able to mass produce bricks, and then they made these houses all the same because that made it very efficient. You could efficiently and quickly build them that way. They also had plumbing, which is also kind of unique. Very modern systems for the time, almost equal to that of the Romans. Their government must have been well organized in order for them to have these organized cities. If they hadn't had organized governments, their cities wouldn't have looked this well. Farmers must have made up most of the population because they did raise a lot of grains, dates, fruits, meat animals like sheep, goats, and cows were all raised. And they were polytheistic because they had multiple temples to multiple gods and goddesses. So polytheistic means that they believe in many gods and goddesses. Eventually, this first Indian civilization is going to go into a decline and disappear. We're not exactly sure why. There's no real clear evidence of what happened. And again, we can't decipher their writings, so we don't know for sure. But there's several possibilities. That could have been maybe an ecological disaster, like a flood or an earthquake that demolished the cities, and then they moved away from them. They could have been overrun by nomadic peoples. There were nomads that were very powerful in the area at the time. They were called the Aryans, and they could have come in maybe and taken over. But from the evidence that's available in the remains of the cities is that a massacre is probably the most possible reason for their decline and disappearance, because there are signs that something bad happened. There's burned timbers and destruction of buildings that wouldn't have happened through natural occurrences. So there's some suggestion that something bad happened, and that's why they disappeared. The next major kingdom is the kingdom of the Ganges, and so obviously this is going to be located around the Ganges River. The kingdom of the Ganges is going to usher in the Vedic age, and the Vedic age is going to focus on, like I said, that group of Aryans that were nomadic. Well, they were nomadic, and they were a mixture of Indian and European, so they're Indo-Europeans. They're lighter skinned than regular Indians because of their mixture with Europeans. But they do migrate quite a bit, looking for water and pasture for their animals. No cities were built by the early Aryans. They were led by a Raja, which is a tribal leader, but there was really no tie to any god like we see in a lot of other civilizations where their leader has God-given powers or they're descended from a god or whatever. They don't have that in the Aryan system. Our knowledge about the Aryans come from the Vedas, and the Vedas are a collection of prayers and hymns and other religious teachings that were popular during the Aryan culture. We know that they believed in sacrifice, especially of horses. Horses were respected and revered as very powerful animals, spiritual animals. And so they're going to value horses, and they're going to value warriors, people who do battle, and they're going to value cattle as well. And so in the Aryan system, in the Aryan culture, the people are going to be divided by their occupation, and you had three basic groups. The first were the Brahmins, and Brahmins were priests, and so they're the leaders of the religious communities. The second group are the Kshatriyas, and the Kshatriyas are warriors, and so they're the second most important. The third group are the Vaishyas, and the Vaishyas were like your farmers and your merchants, your artisans, your herders, people who were in charge of the animals. And so you had these three basic groups, and the Aryans really felt that they were superior to the people that they conquered, and they were constantly conquering other people all the time. They conquer the Dravidians, they conquer other groups around them. And so these people that they conquer are going to make up the fourth group called the Sudras. And the Sudras were the non-Aryan groups. And so this is the beginning of the caste system that we will see develop in India. And we're going to talk more about the caste system. But this is the beginning of it. And it's basically social groups into which people are born and from which you cannot escape. That once you were born into the system, you cannot get out of it. And typically the lighter your skin color, the higher up you were. Like the lighter your skin color, the more likely it is that you're going to be a Brahmin or a Kshatriya rather than a Sudra. Like the Sudra were the darkest people. So it's kind of a racial thing, but it's more of a social class, because the Sudras aren't going to get any lighter because they're not allowed to marry higher classes, kind of thing. So there's no intermixing of the races. So it's kind of a very complex system, but we're going to talk more about it later too. Like I said, the Aryans were also polytheistic. Their religious beliefs, polytheistic, many gods, and most of their gods were the equivalent of natural forces like the sun and fire and storms and that kind of stuff. So how did these Aryans make the transition from nomads to a settled civilized people? Well, they begin to mingle with the people that they conquered, and they're going to learn farming and agriculture, and they begin to build cities, and their cities are going to be walled because, you know, they're nomads. They're used to conquering people, and they don't want to be conquered themselves, so they build these walled cities, and they have multi-storied buildings, so they're learning technology from the people they conquer too. And eventually they're going to get a written language called Sanskrit, and so this is the Aryan written language, which will become the Indian written language, which is called Sanskrit. And with Sanskrit, we're going to see the development of literature in India. For example, India's greatest epic poem is going to be written in Sanskrit, and it's called the Mahabharata, and it's 100,000 verses long. It's a huge poem, but it's a mix of history and mythology and religion, and it tells the story of 5 brothers. And they're the Pandava brothers, and they had lost their kingdom, and it tells the story of how they're trying to regain it. And eventually they do regain their country, their kingdom, and when they do, they restore peace to India and make everything happy and healthy and everything. Another well-known story that's going to be written in Sanskrit is the story of the Ramayana. Now, the story of Ramayana involves the story of the hero Rama and his wife or bride Sita. Now Sita is going to be kidnapped by the demon king Ravana, and it tells how Rama is going to go in and rescue her, and life is going to be fantastic again. So that is the Aryan age, or the Vedic age, because of the Vedas. Eventually, India also goes through an axial age. And if you remember, an axial age comes in a time of crisis, when there's war and there's destruction, and people are not happy with the way things are, and so they're trying to change things. They're going back from the dark ages into a better time, into the light. And so the axial age thought of India at this time is to, end this era of crisis, that they were undergoing frequent war, they had an expanding economy, but they also were enduring forced migration from their places, new governments, new gods that they had to learn. So it was just a time of turmoil. And so we're going to see a new ethical teaching emerge from this, that there's ethical standards or moral values that must be followed. And the goals of this is to end the bloodshed, to end ambition based on greed rather than for the welfare of the people, to end exploitation, to end immorality. So they have these lofty goals, and they're not maybe always successful in carrying them out, but they do try. But from this, we're going to see a new form of thinking, and in some respects, it's a religion, and it's called Zoroastrianism. And it's created by a man named Zoroaster, and he's from the Iran-Persia region, and so he comes up with this idea of thinking. And in his time period, there was a lot of war, a lot of invasion, a lot of new gods and cults that were coming about, and so he creates his own new religion that he's going to follow. And he chooses a fire god called Ahura Mazda, who is the divine champion of truth and justice. Kind of sounds like he's part of the Justice League, but he's a fire god that Zoroaster is going to latch onto and say, this is the god I'm going to follow, because he is the divine champion of truth and justice. And so it sounds like a really, really awesome, good thing. So there's kind of two views on what Ahura Mazda really is. Is he the strongest god of many, or is he the only god? And so there's kind of this thought that maybe Ahura Mazda and Zoroastrianism is the very earliest monotheist religion, because there's this belief in one god. But again, there's some confusion on whether or not he was the only god, or if he was just the strongest one of all of them. Anyway, so what is Zoroastrianism? What do they believe in? Why is it such a good thing? Well, the source of all this religion are called the Avesta. And the Avesta is the scripture. And then you have the Gathas, and the Gathas are the hymns. So it's kind of like having the Bible and our, religious teachings. But basically, there's a lot of hostility towards nomads, that nomads bring in evil influences, and so you have to watch out for them. You have to avoid them at all costs, and that kind of thing. And there's this sort of, within this religion, there's this teaching of responsibility, that it's a truly good versus evil kind of thing. It's a really that thinking that it's humans who have the responsibility of making sure that good prevails, and so you need to do good things on Earth, kind of thing, to prevent the bad from happening. And so that's kind of the underpinning of Zoroastrianism, what it really is. It's really an epic battle of good versus evil, and that humans have to take on the responsibility for being good and staying good. So that's the early part of Indian history.